It's a bit windier than usual. It's lovely to be outside. As usual, starting actually an hour earlier today because of a very, very exciting event that is happening later tonight that I'm sure many of you will be attending. But as usual, we'll start our discussion on the hour, so just waiting another few minutes for people to join. Hope you have all been having excellent lockdowns. We are very close to the end in New Zealand. So if you're joining from overseas, I hope that you too are soon to the end, and I hope that end is appropriately timed rather than slightly too early. Neat. I think we can start discussion now. As you can see, I'm wearing my jersey. It has become a little bit colder. Winter is arriving, which is a little bit miserable. Today we're going to be talking about different kinds of motions, because if you are new to debating, you will note that there is a dizzying variety of them. Go through those different types and explain exactly how you should approach those motions in terms of setting up your case, in terms of thinking about the fundamentals of this debate. And I'd note that I think this is actually really good, useful discussion for people who are a little bit farther along in their debating career, either intermediate or advanced, because figuring out how to optimize precisely for the motion is kind of necessary to win debates at higher level. If you are not quite understanding the difference of how to approach a shoulds debate versus an actor debate versus a policy debate, those are things that allow the opposition very easily to outflank you and can hold you back enormously. As usual, flick through either a comment to this live stream that I'm following or to the anonymous form that has been linked in the description, and I'll be able to answer your questions in real time to get through things. So, as you will know from earlier discussions, we've talked a lot about two things in these development series. And these are the two things that I think are most important to cover as soon as you start thinking about emotion. So from the first moments of your prep, these are the things to be thinking about. And those two are the comparative. What are the two things that we are comparing? What are the two positions? What are the two worlds? Because if you don't understand what the other team is standing for, and if you aren't clear about what exactly you stand for, it becomes very difficult for the rest of the debate to happen effectively and for you to win. And then secondly, the framework. How should the judge approach judging the debate? What needs to be proved in order to win it? So dealing with that broader framework that you set up, spelling out for the judge what you need to do to win. So you will note that often people, when they discuss different motions, will discuss something that they call burdens. And what they mean by a burden within the debate is essentially an obligation that they want to push towards the opposition in the mind of the judge and try and force the opposition to meet those burdens to win those debates. And if you think about burdens, burdens will be very different depending on what exactly the motion says and what type of motion it is. And it also breaks down quite neatly in terms of what we are talking about with the comparative and in terms of what we are talking about with the framework. How so? So when you're thinking about burdens, particularly through those lens of comparative and framework, the way I think about the comparative framework, comparative and the framework, is your comparative in terms of burden is what do teams need to argue for? What is the position it is necessary for the opposition to take in order for them to even have that debate? That necessarily becomes the baseline or the minimum of the comparative, although of course more stuff can be added onto it, because if you're not arguing for what the position the motion says that you need to argue for, you're not engaging with the debate and you will very likely lose that debate. In terms of the framework, it's what do teams need to prove to win. So not what do teams need to argue for, what do teams need to prove to win within those positions that have been set up by the motion. And that's when your framework analysis comes in, explaining exactly to the adjudicator how the framework operates. Okay, so let's go through how for the comparative, you can think about the different types of burdens that can be put on you by the motion. So the first thing that you need to note is there is essentially involuntary things or compulsory things that you need to stand for that come directly from the motion themselves. And I like to think of these as the involuntary or compulsory parts of the comparative. Sometimes it's not actually explicit though, because of course, sometimes it will be explicit. It'll be like that we would ban X, Y, and Z drug. And you'd be like, well, if you're not standing for banning X, Y, and Z drug, you are not standing for your side of the motion and you are very likely to lose it. So sometimes the motion very explicitly sets those out. And note, if they set out a range of things you have to defend, you need to defend all of those things. I have one joint scroll debate for the sole reason that the opposition decided that half of the motion they didn't want to talk about at all. And then we were like, very clearly, it's in the motion. And then they lost the debate. So need to be very clear that you're defending each part of the motion. Sometimes, though, your involuntary or your mandatory parts of the burden that you need to stand for are non-explicit. And the way I like to think about this is sometimes it'll be necessary to do something if the motion sets up achieving an outcome. So, for example, the debate being like that we would take a criminal justice approach, a harsh criminal justice approach to dealing with X, Y, and Z problem. You need to make sure that you're actually standing for a harsh criminal justice response, so dealing with the explicit words of the motion, but you also need to make sure that you're setting up a model that actually deals with the problem at hand. Because if you set up something that is very, very, though maybe harsh, but is very actually low burden, something that everyone agrees on, something that doesn't go particularly to solving the response, you leave yourself very open to being challenged by the opposition, explaining that your model that you've proposed or what your position that you are standing for isn't in line with the spirit of the motion or isn't an effective way to prop that motion because it is unable at all to achieve the outcome that is set out within the motion. So note, sometimes the explicit, the stuff that is mandatory for you to set up in your version of the comparative won't actually be explicit in the motion, but you'll need to provide something that is sufficient to achieve an outcome that is specified within the motion. The second thing that you need to argue for is things that you bind yourself to. So these are the voluntary things, and this will often be through a model. So your first speaker will set up, this is how we'll achieve this particular policy that we want to deal with, or this is what we think are the details of the thing that's explicitly set out for us. And then you've bound yourself to dealing with those. Note, it is very difficult to extract yourself from a model that has been set up particularly poorly because the judge, especially later within the debate, wants the debate to be a clear clash of ideas and not a shifting sands of the opposition. So to some degree, you are bound to your earlier statement as to what you stand for within your model. So you need to be think very clearly about what you want to sign yourself up for in terms of the specifics. And note there is, of course, going to be some back and forth. If you include like some tiny half point within your model that isn't fully developed, and then they run away with it and it isn't actually that important to, and they make it into this huge harm, some judges will allow you to jettison that and try and backtrack on it. But the more core your model is to the motion that is being debated, the harder it is to try and shift the way that you deal with it. It is important, I think, to discuss mutual exclusivity, because I think there's slightly bad advice that is given to debaters often. And that advice is that you should never run something that is non-mutually exclusive to the opposition. What is meant by mutual exclusivity is material that the opposition can equally claim, or material that's out of the debate. A classic example is education. If the debate is about legalizing drugs and you're like, no, what we need is more like education for people, the opposition can very easily stand up and be like, yeah, well, we also support education. Everyone supports education. That's not mutually exclusive, therefore we also get those benefits. Note, where mutual exclusivity is useful and not useful is when you're not trying to claim the benefits of that mutual exclusivity. So for example, if you are trying to argue that we are the only side that gets the huge benefits of education, you're not going to be the team to win because they're also going to be standing for education. But note, having a non-mutually exclusive alternative can quite usefully decrease the opposition's ability to claim benefits. So say they're like, there's this problem, we're going to solve it through these means. And you're like, no, there's this other solution that, though it's not mutually exclusive, will help solve those problems without any of the costs. And if you entirely solve that problem, then you don't need that other model, which may have costs that it exceed it. So note, you can set up an alternative that is non-mutually exclusive. And in fact, I think it's a good thing to articulate all of the different ways that the problem can be minimized, that both teams can agree on, to try and limit the benefit that the opposition claims within a debate. Even if they claim it too, they're still taking away impetus for their policy to be put in. So that's how you think about your burden when you're thinking about comparatives. How do you think about it when you're dealing with frameworks? So once again, two things I think that are important here, two ways to break it down as to how to deal exactly with those with the setting up that framework. So sometimes the framework by which the debate is judged will be very explicitly within the motion. So say, for example, the debate explains to you that you need to stand for X thing, and the opposition tries to be like, no, the framework by which you judge this debate is achieving this other outcome that's irrelevant to that thing. You can just say, no, we're not trying to solve that particular problem. That problem can be solved through a range of different other things. What we're trying to solve is this particular problem. So that sometimes that'll be quite explicit within the motion, because the motion is about achieving a particular goal, not about achieving any other goals that may be ancillary to it. Even though those may be like subsequent benefits or side benefits, that's not what the debate is about. The debate may specify what exactly the explicit framework you need to debate with is in. But the second thing that is quite important is often you will set yourself burdens within points themselves. So where this is particularly useful is to think about where the two teams agree about things and where they disagree. And often where you disagree and who is able to win there will become your burden within the debate. So say, for example, there's a debate about a particular policy, and both teams agree exactly on what the outcome is going to be. Say it's a very like 1 + 1 = 2 outcome. Everyone agrees that that's going to happen. But there's going to be disagreement over whether or not it's a good thing for that to happen or a bad thing for that to happen. Note the way that the debate actually plays out, the points that you actually bring to the debate will have an impact then on the burden, because then what the judge is assessing is not, have I think this team has proved that this is going to happen? The AF team doesn't get any benefit from the fact that they've proved X thing will happen because both teams agree that it'll happen. The burden becomes whether or not it is a good thing or a bad thing. So sometimes those burdens will be quite flexible within debates, and you should think about it as, what do I need to, within the context of the debate, prove to the judge in order to win the debate? If I agree about something with the opposition, I should probably explain why that doesn't mean that the opposition wins the debate, but it'll normally indicate that there's an underlying clash or an underlying issue that's important to deal with in order to win the debate. So that's the baseline discussion of those different ideas of burdens as applies to the comparative and as applied to the framework of the debate. There, once you start getting deeper into setting up the framework, then you start thinking a little bit more about how do you actually contest one version of what is good versus one version of what the other team thinks is good. Because I think this is one of the most difficult parts of debating. It's very easy to try and argue about the practicalities of points. It'll have this much consequence versus this much consequence. What's more difficult is trying to establish value within a debate. And a very useful tool in terms of thinking about this is the World Judging Manual, because that outlines a neat way for judges to think about the ways they should be crediting different frameworks that teams bring and how to agree with one over the other. So they're very explicit that you shouldn't be inserting what you think is most important, rather you should be taking your clues from the debate. So I'm just going to go through how the world's judging manual explains how judges should approach it and how that should apply to you as a speaker trying to incorporate those skills and techniques into your debating. So the first thing a judge will do is just ask, is there one criterion or principle that all teams explicitly agree is true and important? So very often this will be like, if a debate is about like medicine, it'll be about like saving lives, or like hostage notes, and you'll have like this overall goal of we just want to do the least harm, we want to save the most people's lives, and everyone will explicitly agree on a goal very, very quickly. This is very similar to the example we used when discussing frameworks earlier and the different burdens that can come from one agreed outcome and different good or bad, but it's the inverse, where everyone agrees that you want to achieve one thing, but they disagree as to what the outcome of the motion is, whether it leads to a positive thing for that overall goal or a negative thing. So if you are able to find something that is both teams agree on, don't feel the need to try and branch out or challenge them, because sometimes the debate will just be quite clear there. Sometimes there'll be an implicit understanding of what is important. So say no one explicitly argues that X thing is true, but all the analysis is advanced in those direction, that will be taken by the judge as being the foundation. And I think a useful thing, especially within later speeches, is to point out if a lot of the argumentation tries to achieve particular goals, and then press on the judge that those are the things that are important to prove within the debate, because that is very useful for then being able to shift the judge away from thinking about the periphery points that the opposition might want to be arguing towards the material that you've then taken implicitly and made explicit to them that this is the most important material. The next layer is, say there isn't agreement. So you're trying to push one over the other, and you can't just be sneaky because no one's really discussed it in the later speeches. You could kind of have to do it the same way you do any other type of debating. So you are asserting different metrics and you try and provide the best reasons to believe that the metric is the most important one to debate. And note, remember, you're still trying to articulate to the ordinary intelligent voter or the average intelligent voter or the average global citizen, all the different words we basically just mean like a smart debater who cares about things that most people care about and think is important. All of your arguments need to be generated towards persuading this particular person or explaining why this is important in most people's lives, why that average intelligent voter would believe that this is something that is important. Normally, how these types of frameworks break down is, on the one hand, there'll be a consequentialist framework or competing consequentialist frameworks. And I think they're like consequentialism is the umbrella framework, and it's potentially a little bit artificial to refer to competing frameworks within that because they all want to achieve the greater good or utilitarian outcomes, the consequentialist outcomes there. But there are actually competing frameworks even within consequentialist backgrounds that I talked about previously, and I'll go over briefly again. But I will note that if you have consequentialism, you also have non-consequentialist arguments that I'll discuss just after discussing the consequentialism. So if everyone agrees that outcomes are the most important things, practical material, how do we get benefits for people and how do we decrease the harm that people feel, how do you make points that effectively are able to assert one framework over the other? We had a very, very excellent presentation, I think, a couple of weeks ago on weighing how to bring different, make points more or less important. And the thing that it boiled down to is if you're trying to prove that a point is relevant, and remember, relevant just means it helps win the debate. It's part of the framework by which we're judging the debate. You have to do two things. You have to impact that point, say how big the practical consequence is, because no, it's a lot easier to win when your practical consequence is big, and then weigh it. So compare the consequence against other consequences that have been brought or non-consequential points within the debate. So saying why the consequentialism is better than non-consequentialist arguments. And the way you do that is to be very explicit. Firstly, after you've done your impacting, how big it is, then just go, okay, so what you need to decide between is this outcome that we're able to prove that is severe, certain, harmful, very widespread, going through those different factors that we talked about, then comparing it explicitly, they've only been able to achieve these things, we shouldn't care about these people, or the impact is lesser on them. So you have to do a very explicit weighing there between the different kinds of points. And because it all feeds back to that same framework of consequentialism, you'll be able to push it one way or the other within that consequentialist framework. It becomes a little bit more complex when you're adding non-consequentialist arguments. And note, I think this is something New Zealand teams do quite badly. And I think it's because there is a culture within New Zealand debating that is very consequentialist and really just wants to think about outcomes of debate. And that's a fine way to think about debating, but I would note very strongly that it's not reflective of what other circuits do. And sometimes New Zealanders lose debates because they don't fully grapple in explaining why they want that consequentialist framework, because they just assume everyone can get away with it. And I would also note that I think this plays into another potential weakness of the New Zealand circuit, but it is just something that's unique to us, and that I think New Zealanders get away with ignoring arguments a lot more. A lot of other circuits put a lot more weight on just addressing every argument and responding to every argument, where the majority of the way that principal points are dealt with in New Zealand is just being like, haha, principal point dumb. I care about impacts, I care about outcomes. And then all the judges are like, yes, I also care about that, because we have a culture in New Zealand of caring about impacts and caring about outcomes. If you are ever judging overseas, make sure that you deal with the principal points brought by the opposition in a way that isn't just dismissive. You need to actually explain why you think that consequentialism is more important, lean on your emotive rhetoric, build into obviously New Zealanders often think that consequentialism is more important. You just need to go into those arguments in quite a specific way. But I also think that non-consequentialist arguments can be quite useful, and we should learn how to develop them appropriately. Of course, it's very, very bad if you just throw the non-consequentialist argument out there and say, you should believe this because I think it is wrong to do X, Y, and Z, even if it leads to better outcomes. Obviously, that's not a line that'll succeed, but we can do actually work to explain why we care about particular things from a non-consequentialist lens. So for example, lots of people care about bodily autonomy. Most people wouldn't say that it's appropriate for us to harvest people's organs without their consent, even if you can save lots of lives by killing that one particular person. So we have a strong moral intuition against that. Most people, even in New Zealand debating, wouldn't probably adopt a strictly consequentialist outcome for there. So you need to start thinking about how you develop that bodily autonomy point. Or for example, it's a point about how much someone deserves something, whether or not they have moral ownership over something so that they'll be able to claim, whether we have a duty to particular people. Often when we think about debates about colonialism or history, you have to think about how those historical actions impact the future from the moral obligations, not merely the consequences that flow on from it. And the way you do this, I think I'm a little bit sneaky in that I tend to be I think about principled points or non-consequentialist points in a sneakily consequentialist way. So trying to explain why it has long-term value or why we think this thing is important in general, but you need to go through that way of thinking in terms of explaining why a non-consequentialist point should have value within a debate, why we think it has value if society adopts it as a standard, why those principles are something that we should hold strongly to within society, rather than just asserting it. I think it's bad that in New Zealand we just assert that consequentialism is good without spending time going through it and thinking it, and I have lost debates to overseas teams because I'm like, that principle point is unimaginably dumb. Of course, we think that it's bad for people to die or for there to be bad outcomes rather than just having vague principled material. And I've lost debates like that. So need to think a little bit more about how we actually develop non-consequentialist material and how we weigh it. Okay, so that was once again a big overview of the way that the comparative and the framework operate and how you should be thinking about those particular issues. Recommend once again, if you have any questions, please flick through a message. It is difficult to talk for many hours without any responses, but if you have no questions, if everything I've said makes perfect sense so far, can just carry on. The second thing we're going to be discussing is how to deal with different motions and shift the way you start preparing your case all the way to how you engage with those fundamentals of the debate, depending on the different types of motions. So what we're going to do now, just walk through those different types of motions. The most common, most popular type of motion is your classic policy motion, that we would do X, that we would ban drugs, that we would open all borders. Sometimes it's phrased in a slightly different way, that we believe we should open all borders or we should ban drugs. I personally think these are quite interchangeable ways of framing it, because we tend to adopt the same standard as the average voter when we're engaging with the should versus just going ahead and doing it. So that framework tends to be almost I think identical. So not a huge difference there, but often you will have those policy motions. So when you get your classic policy motions, how do you start thinking about it from the comparative and the framework? So remember, the first thing you do is you're looking at the motion, you're teasing out all the keywords, you're thinking about things, then you come up with your comparative. What do we think both teams are going to be standing for in this debate? if you are been given a policy, it's normally quite clear that you ban all drugs. So there, you have your involuntary, what you have to stand for within the motion, and then you can add the voluntary things. You can explain how you'll ban drugs. You can add nuances. You can add softenings, as long as it's still within like the board sphere of banning drugs. You can think about how you can drag your model to set yourself up best for what? For getting your framework, because that's the second thing that you're necessarily thinking about. What are the things that are important? Why would we have this policy? What are the problems it's trying to solve? Often when you were coaching schools debaters, we try and teach them to spot the problem that is trying to be solved. So if you figure out those problems, you'll probably neatly be able to get your framework. Remember, always thinking like, okay, am I adopting too much of a consequentialist lens? Am I just thinking about outcomes when the opposition might bring like a bodily autonomy point or a different principle material? How do I preempt that and build that into my case? Thinking about that framework, building your comparative so that it neatly flows off to dealing with those points, and then putting yourself on the strongest foot for the debate. Note, the opposition should also be doing the same type of thinking. As an opposition team, you need to think not just about how you would address the average person putting forward this motion, because note, most debaters are actually way smarter than the average person. You'll be thinking, the team that is proposing this is going to be sitting down being like, there's this huge problem that everyone's going to see immediately when they see this motion. How can we do something sneaky with how we set up the debate, set up what we stand for, that try and gets rid of this problem? So say, for example, in banning drugs, they'll be like, we don't stand for the war against drugs. We wouldn't over-police communities. In fact, we'd barely police them at all. We would do X, Y, and Z that we think will decrease the harms of the war on drugs. So they'll be trying to set it up there. So don't try and debate against the version of the world that you think is most likely. Think about the version of the world that they'll most want to stand for and start thinking about how you'll be able to counter that. Note, you're also able to construct your comparative to some degree. Because remember, you should firstly be decreasing some of their harms, even by asserting non-mutually exclusive things. Be like, oh, that problem is dealt with by this thing that both teams stand for. Therefore, they can't claim it as a reason to have this policy because we're able to solve it as well very easily. And then thinking about what you're going to be standing for that is mutually exclusive. So say, for the example, the debate is about invading Afghanistan in response to, I don't know, years down the track, the Taliban breaks the deal. That's like might soon be agreed, but you know, global politics a little bit up in the air. And then thinking, well, if we're not going to be invading, there's 5,000 other things we can do in this realm. So what are the things that we're going to stand for that aren't the same as invading, but for example, maybe more effective? So for example, if you're putting boots on the ground, it's probably quite difficult to have diplomatic relations. So you'd be like, no, we're going to pursue a strong diplomatic pathway, strong diplomatic sanctions, we're going to achieve X, Y, and Z. So you are also thinking about how much you can extract in terms of a smart alternative strategy that you can without adopting the motion that the opposition needs to prompt. So both teams will be thinking about that in terms of the comparative. Both teams will be thinking about what their priorities are, trying to sneak in different priorities. And just need to, like, this is the cleanest type of debate, covers a lot of what we've already discussed within this. Okay, we've got a cool question from my wonderful flatmate. How should I handle debating about motions that I know very little about? Excellent question. The first thing that comes first is there's a lot of time before, I guarantee you will debate debates that you know nothing about. There's a lot of time until you debate those debates. So do your best to not be in the position where you don't know anything. Make sure that you're reading the news as much as possible. Make sure if you frequently hear debaters talking about something and you're like, oh my God, I have no clue how the minimum wage operates, or I have no clue what like, a buy-in is or a buyout or what stock buybacks are. Just be like, I'm going to Google that thing. I think it's important to think about proactively building your knowledge, making sure that you're engaging with news, making sure you're filling your gaps where there is gaps within your knowledge. And a lot of this will be talking to your teammates, talking to other people about topics that they're interested in, and then trying to fill yourself in on those topics. But say, out of no fault of your own, you've arrived at a motion that is totally out of left field. Say they've set the debate about like the Sudanese flag, and you don't know how to address it. The first thing you do is remember that you have teammates, and your teammates will often know things that you don't know. I once did a debate about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I didn't even know that body had existed before the prep started. Luckily, my teammate was writing his thesis on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and he was like, don't worry, Daniel, I've got this. And I learned a lot about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank at that moment. Sometimes you'll need to tease this material out of your teammates. They'll be a little bit less certain, or you might be the person who always generates the cases, but you know nothing, and their role is more to be quiet. So you need to empower them to upskill, be very honest. Hey, I know nothing about this topic. Do you know anything? How can we trade information to build it up? Because they might assume that you know things. So just be very open and honest and transparent with your partner, and hopefully one of you will know something about it. If then neither of you know anything about it, think, do I know anything that is similar to this? Say the debate is about invading Afghanistan, the argument get, and you know nothing about the politics in Afghanistan and you're against invading, but you know some stuff about invasions in general. You know about the war in Iraq, you know about the war in Syria, and you know some of the cons to that. Just be like, those bad things will also happen here because we're also invading a place that doesn't want us to invade them. So there's some first principle arguments that you can have there that if you just know analogous situations, you are able to fill in. And sometimes you'll lose debates because you don't know enough, and that happens. That's like fine. It's no bad reflection on you to lose a debate to a team that knows more, and knowing more is able to give them the advantage, and that then helps them win. But what I will say is that a lot of teams beat teams that know more about them because they do those first principle stuff more. They think about those analogies. They know that often if it's an obscure topic, the judge doesn't know much either. So like the specialized knowledge of the opposition is all just assertions and you can push back against them. So don't lose hope. Debate the way you normally would. Try and find those analogies. Try and find those things that you do know about and bring them into the debate. And that's the way that you're able to at least give a decent showing of yourself within those environments. And then, of course, after the debate, do a bit of a Google, figure out that topic so that you're never left in the dark about that again. But hopefully the other team will know, well, hopefully the other team won't know lots, but hopefully there will be at least a good debate where you both figure out slowly what the debate is about and you're able to deal with it in that way. Very good question. Okay, so let's discuss the second type of motion that often comes up. These are called analysis motions overseas. In New Zealand, they tend to be called things like judgment motions. And basically what that is being like, is X statement true? So say, for example, this house believes that X is better than X, or that someone has done more harm than good, or that this policy is so remember, sometimes there'll be policy motions. So you got to think a little bit about those like value judgments. I don't think those are particularly different. But sometimes you just get one that believes X thing is true. That like a good example is like this house believes that like drag is bad or drag is moral. And what you then do is you just need to do exactly the same thing, just being like, what exactly do they stand for? What exactly does drag mean? What is the characterization we stand for? And then what does it mean to be immoral? How are we taking into account different stakeholders? How are we pushing one thing rather than another? But note, you have a little bit less room to do that stuff about the comparative that I was talking about earlier. There's less room for you to push an ideal version of the world or ideal version how you'll do the model, and there's less room to push your own alternative because they're not proposing anything. So the data is a little bit more set in stone as to what has already happened or policies that are pre-existing and we're just seeing play out there. So you don't have as much room to evolve it. Note, of course, as the negating team, though you can't be like, we would do this policy as like a like we can do this, you have to explain why that's likely to happen. So you have to engage with the world where you have much less control to push an alternative policy, but you can still think about what do I think was likely to happen if we didn't have this? And often, for example, in debates where it's fixing a particular problem, do not let the affirming team get away with, in the absence of this solution, this problem would have been huge, enormous, and everything would have collapsed, because you can be like, no, what would have likely have happened is we would have used XYZ other solution that's likely to happen because obviously, as you've said, it's a bad problem and we'd be willing to use these and we'd overcome our political divides in order to get those things across because there'd be certain costs. And that would have been a far better long-term solution. So you have a way to like bring in alternatives, but note you can't just claim that these alternatives will happen or assert that they'll happen. You need to explain why they're likely to happen. So remember, analysis motions are stuck in a reality that you have much less control over as opposed to a policy motion. So you need to be clear as to how you think that'll play out. Then you have some quite specific both analysis / policy motions. And those will be things like this house prefers X or Y or X over Y. Note, this is once again where you have much less control over the comparative because both sides have been specified exactly what they need to stand for. Often it'll be like, you need to stay within the world that has already occurred. So we prefer an Obamacare approach to a free market approach to healthcare. Note, You'll need to explain what Obamacare is like. You can't just be like, we would change Obamacare in these ways. And equally, they would be bound. Of course, they've got a little more room to be like, what do we think is likely to happen with a free market approach? How do we think the system is likely to be set up or evolve? But once again, a little bit more of a constriction as to what the comparative is. But all of these motions, you should be constructing your framework in similar ways, thinking about how you'll be setting up the debate and walking it through it like that. So it prefers two very explicit comparatives. Often you won't be able to do a counterfactual, need to argue the status quo if it's quite clear. So if, say, for example, the motion was this house prefers a world in which all people have superpowers, that's quite explicit as to what you need to stand for, and then you need to explain why it is particularly false. And often it's where there wouldn't be like a particular model, but no, a model is just part of your characterization, part of your comparative. And those are very specific type of it. You should always be thinking about it even in motions that lack this explicit need to set up a model. Say for like this house prefers a world where all people had superpowers. You don't need to set up a model for that, but you need to characterize what that world will look like and explain exactly what the position you stand for is. Then you get motions that are like this house regrets or this house supports. These are motions that are very, very tied to assessing the actual outcomes of the policy. So you have the least room to develop what you think, what you would do if you had the ability to shape this policy. So say, for example, the motion was this house regrets Obamacare. You can't be like, we would do these X things, we would use the spirit of Obamacare, we would do the motion, the policies that are actually, we just implement them better. We think that the motion allows us to implement these policies effectively. Therefore, Republican opposition that destroys the bill shouldn't play into the debate. If it's about like this house regrets Obamacare, you need to accept it even if the policy is failing, even if the policy is inefficacious in a way that wouldn't be a fair attack if it was just a strict policy motion. So you need to deal with like the actual lived reality of that motion, of that policy, rather than how you would set it up if, say, for example, it was a policy debate. So once again, more constricted, comparative, but different ways of dealing with the framework in exactly the same way as you're dealing with all of those other things. Note, once again, when you are thinking about regrets motions, you need to be thinking as a negating team, what can I stand for? Because you always have a position, even if the position is just denying everything the opposition has there, that is still a position. It's just as much a position. It's just as much a choice as any other position. You need to be thinking about what you would stand for. And note, regrets motions doesn't strictly allow you to set up your own version of what's going to happen. So you're going to be like, well, even if we regret Obamacare, what we would have done is have a socialist-style medical healthcare system that would have been outstanding. Note, that's not something you can do. You don't have the same amount of fiat if it's a normal policy motion. What you are allowed to do is, similar to what I was explaining before, explain why this was likely to happen. And this is the counterfactual. The counterfactual is saying, in the absence of this policy happening, this is what would have happened and how it wouldn't play out. And remember, a lot of things are dynamic. So a world that regrets something isn't just a world without that thing. There's a whole bunch of systemic effects or things that swing in when you take out one of the levers of governance to try and fill those gaps. So you're not left with nothing. You're not left with no policy response, but you need to clearly characterize this is what we think is likely to have happened. And often in regrets debates, the whole debate just becomes being like, we agree that this was an unideal policy. Do we think that would have likely followed, been better, or would have been worse? So an example of that is that in my third year, the joint scroll final was that we regret Brown and Board of Education, which was a Supreme Court decision in the United States that desegregated high schools. And we were regretting it. So we were trying to assert that something else would have happened in its place. And we were like, what we think was likely to happen is a desegregation decision would still have been made in a roughly similar time frame. There are lots of court cases happening, but it wouldn't have started at schools. It would have started with things like the army or public bus stations or X, Y, and Z, and then would slowly have got to education. So what we would have wanted is a slowing of this process, and that's what we think the counterfactual world is. And the whole debate became about whether we think that would likely happen, how we think that it would play out with the characterization of delaying it slightly, would that have the impact that we were talking about? So had a normal debate, but the real clash point was about how that counterfactual operates get very into those characterizations. I really like regrets debates because they're very, very like rhetorical and rely on like very strong analysis as to how things happening, telling really intuitive, really important stories. So they're very fun to do, but they restrict you in a way that a policy motion doesn't. So then we have the two types of motions that are a little bit different from all of those other things that happened, in that it'll set it to a particular institution or actor that plays out. And note, while I think both of them limit it to an actor, these two types, only one of them is an actor debate. So this can be a little bit confusing, and so I'll go through exactly what happens. And I want to caution you, if the debate specifies an actor, say for example, this House believes that the United States should defund the WHO, that doesn't make it an actor debate. And the phrasing that we use, like this is an actor debate, is often something that will hold you back in debating. You'll misinterpret the motion, so you need to read the words very carefully. Okay, so let's go through the distinction between these. This House believes that the United States should defund the WHO. Is very different to this House as the United States would defund the WHO. And the reason why they are different is because the should motion, that the United States should do it, uses the same framework as any other policy debate. And this can be entirely different. So for example, this House believes that the United States should give $1 trillion to dealing with HIV. I think that's a very, very strong AF in that phrasing of the motion, because of course they should, right? That will be a way more effective spending of that money than almost anything else they will do. There are lots of people living with HIV in their country who've been massively historically fucked over and deserve investment in their health problems. So everyone would be like, why on earth would you set that as a motion? Because of course they should invest in HIV medication. Like, duh, of course they should do it. This is different from a motion that says, for example, that as the United States, we would invest in HIV medication. Because what you do with an actor debate, a motion that follows this House as X person or as X institution do it, is you adopt the preferences and worldview of that particular person. So you would think about, if I was the United States, not is this the right thing to do from a policy motion, but is this something that I would do? Is this something that I think is within my interests and that I should pursue as course? And for example, if you were the Reagan administration and there was a lot of conservatives and you could like benefit from having like not a good response to HIV and allow millions of people to die, because as the Reagan administration, you very clearly don't care about gay people. You've made it very explicit that you don't care about gay people. You need to adopt those preferences and those policies in terms of how you think about how you run those motions. And note, you will often disagree with the actor, and that is why actor debates are a little bit fun. It's quite fun to discuss what Russia should do, because you're not really constrained by what is the right thing for a global actor to do. You just think like, what would Russia do? How would they engage with this? How would they maximize their preferences in these particular circumstances? So you engage with a as X person motion with their preferences, and then there's a big argument about their preferences. No, we think that Putin's preferences are actually X, Y, and Z, therefore we should adopt this other policy. Or we think the Chinese Communist Party should do it X, Y, and Z, therefore we should do this. A great example is the world's final was this House as the Chinese Communist Party would like free Hong Kong or would grant universal suffrage to the people of Hong Kong. And that was an excellent debate about what the Chinese Communist Party cares about, how they maximize those preferences. And it was, yeah, excellent debate going through all those different things. Note, I think everyone outside of the CCP probably thinks that Hong Kong, that the CCP should allow Hong Kong to become a democracy, that it's wrong for China to do it, but China doesn't think that. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't think that. So you have to adopt their preferences. I would note here, there's a little bit of disagreement about the degree to which you take on the irrationalities of someone that you represent. Say being like, of course this will hurt Putin. It's a wrong strategic make for Putin to make, but Putin has made similar decisions before. We think this is the way that Putin thinks. Therefore, they're likely to do it anyway. Me, and I think most other debaters, don't agree that this is something you can do with the window debate. You don't just explain that they would do a thing. As an alcoholic, you would drink lots of alcohol. You can't just say, well, alcoholics can't resist that. We know logically the way that their brain works, therefore they do their thing, therefore we win that debate. you have to be optimizing the preferences of that person. And that means sometimes making a different decision to what they would actually make, but a decision that if you presented the argument to them and they were very open to the argument, they would take on as their preferred policy. And the way I like to think about it is collaborative decision making. So you have the person sitting down in front of you and you are trying to convince them to do X thing. You are going to be like, Putin, I know you really want to execute X, Y, and Z person, but you care more about your power, so don't make a short-term irrational decision. Even if that's something Putin would actually do, make the long-term smart strategic decision, and that'll be best for you. And then Putin will be like, wow, Daniel, what an amazing argument. You're right. I shouldn't make that decision that I maybe would have made because you've been able to explain to me why it's in my interest or why it actually aligns with my preferences to do X, Y, and Z thing. So a little bit of a disagreement there within the debating community, but I think it's quite clear that you should be optimizing their preferences, not adopting, say, for example, a super short-term perspective, unless there's like a clear preference for them to be short-term, not just something they're automatically doing, just being like, I've only got 3 months to live. Of course, I'm going to prioritize like my short-term outcomes over long-term outcomes. You adopt the preferences and you explain why within those preferences they should go one way or the other, and they're going to be the average. They're going to suddenly have the perspective of the average reasonable voter with those person's preferences. They're going to be really open to your argument. They're going to be like, wow, thank you for considering that. That is my preference. That isn't my preference. Sorry, they won't execute you because we often do these debates about dictators. So yeah, you need to be optimizing the preferences that that particular person has. So let's have a think about whether there are any questions. Don't think there are any questions in the comments. Let's see about in the forum. Nope, no questions in the forum. We can just move on. So I think at the end of this, while waiting for people, if they have any particular questions about different types of motions or how to really optimize your debating style, your cases for different motions, let's just have a quick skim through of everything we've discussed today. So at the beginning of the seminar, we talked about burdens. Your burden is things that you need to do within the debate. You have your comparative burdens, what you need to argue for, what the position the debate forces you to take. And you have your framework burdens, what you need to prove to win the debate. Sometimes that'll come from the motion. Sometimes it'll just be in your points, or that's how the debate will broadly flow out. Then we discussed in specific how you argue with different frameworks. And remember, the world's judging manual is quite a useful thing to show you how judges think. And if you are able to get into the head of a judge and start thinking about, a judge would judge this way, it's way easier to make those arguments. Note, there's going to be areas where everyone explicitly agrees. They all just think different outcomes are going to happen, so they've got the same framework. Sometimes a lot of the arguments will be about particular things, but then there'll be some peripheral arguments. And note, if you are a later speaker in the debate, a smart thing that you can do is to point that out to the adjudicator. Just be like, the opposition wanted to spend all of their time really talking about these two things, and then have some random third point that they never really explained to us why it was important or how it fit into their framework. Therefore, we think that the framework that you should adopt is this. That's not actually like a logical reason why they should disregard that particular framework that has been brought, but it appeals to their sense that I want to judge the debate that has happened, not some other debate. And I think that they're right, that they haven't really explained to me why it's important. Therefore, I'm just going to go with the stuff that was implicitly agreed was important for all the teams. When you are disagreeing about the different types of frameworks, you've got a consequential disagreement, which is very clearly like, how do you impact your points? How do you weigh your points? Those two things equal the relevance of the point within that consequential framework. And then you explain why, just in general, the stuff that you've proved is more important, more harmful, more in line with those outcomes that we care about than the other person has talked about. But note, non-consequential arguments are incredibly important, not because you need to make them, and it is very true that a lot of very good teams almost never make non-consequential outcomes, but you need to respond to them, and you need to actually give them like clear, strong responses and explain why consequentialism is good, especially if you go overseas and there isn't the same assumption overseas that consequentialist arguments are necessarily going to be better than clear, like principled arguments. But sometimes it is good to make like these non-consequentialist arguments, explain why things like autonomy or liberty we should care just as much like as good outcomes, why we don't like the nanny state, And often that is about showing the long-term importance of these principles. So even if you can get a short-term improvement in people's health, we think that losing liberty in this way is still something we shouldn't care about, because we think the enshrining of liberty is something that's important to the development of our society in the long term. So the sneaky way to make principal points is to make them practical, but over a very long time frame. But you can also think about things like desert and obligation that, when developed well and when clearly explained, can actually be consequential arguments. Then we went through all of the different types of motions. So I'll just give you a brief list of all of those different types so that you can write this down. So policy motions, that's just your clear, that we would do X thing. Then you have your analysis motions, which is much more a judgment. Some of these look like policy motions because they'll be like, this house believes that we should do X thing, which basically just is a policy motion, or that this person should do X thing. So you're thinking about how this particular actor is able to follow out that particular pathway. But often it'll be more restrictive. So either it'll be like backwards looking, where you are stuck to like what has actually happened, like explicitly, you're not allowed to have any variations, or it'll be like a prefers world where you can explain how something will develop into the future, and the other team will have to try and develop how they think other alternatives will likely arrive, and those will be better solutions. And then, of course, when you have like clear historical motions like regressive motions, you're building a counterfactual. There's a lot of argument as to what the world actually would look like absent of this policy. So you need to get into the weeds there and explain how all of the different all the different arms of the system respond to those different things. Then we had the two types of actor motions, one which is a pure actor motion or a true actor motion, which is this person, this house as X, or that as X, we would do X thing. And with that type of motion, you need to adopt the preferences and optimize those preferences. So imagine that person is sitting across from you. They don't particularly care about things we know they don't care about. Putin's not going to be swayed by the idea that democracy is wonderful and he should care about democracy. He's going to be convinced by his interests. So you make that argument to that person, which is different to that as X, that this X actor should do this thing, which once again, adopting that broader perspective, Vladimir Putin probably should allow democracy to happen. I think that'd be very an F-weighted debate. So that'll probably be set as like a pure actor debate, but make sure that you're very clear on that distinction and you're able to walk through that distinction, because if you misidentify it, the other team can outflank you and be like, no, it doesn't matter what Putin's preferences are. This is debate what Putin should do, and we think that Putin should stop murdering people, even if Putin likes murdering people. So there's a clear, different style of argumentation that takes place between those two different areas. Okay, last chance to offer some questions. I'll just drink the rest of my tea. And if you have any last questions, just flick them through to the comment section or to the anonymous forum. It's getting a bit gray. So if it starts raining in the next 10 minutes, I'll be very annoyed. I've done a lot of talking today. I'm doing a practice debate after this with my lovely South African friends. So that'll wreck my voice more. Hi to you, Sambu. I don't know who you are. It's lovely to meet you. And I hope you appreciated the seminar. Okay, last chance for questions. Wait another minute. Wonderful. It was lovely to see you all. I hope that your lockdowns go smoothly. We're so close to the end. Special note, Noise from the Bench will be tomorrow, which is very exciting. So come along to that. Obviously, it'll be advertised on our page. And also, tonight is the Women's Development game night. So go along to our Facebook page. Lots of people are going. I think it's going to just be an excellent event. So that starts at 6:30. You've got another hour and a half to, I don't know, prep. Message your friends, be like, we should all go to this amazing Wolfgang DevSoc women's event. So I think that'll be awesome. And neat. Lovely to see you.